In the framework of the EU, the approach of the creation of this internal single market is one that every members will adhere to the doctrine, the acquis and the free movement. When you leave that area and you enter into a free trade agreement or within the WTO, you enter a different setting. It becomes a bargaining approach. What can you give me in exchange of what can I give you? And this is the fundamental difference between the EU as it is today, the internal market, and everything outside. And so, although I agree that regulatory-wise we share rules and regulations so far, but when Brexit happens, it's a change of paradigm. And we don't stay, the UK doesn't stay in the single market. Then it's all up for grabs. The EU doesn't not have to grant anything beyond what it has committed in the WTO. And at that point, it's what they want in exchange of what they are able to get. I would argue that every country of the WTO, every member of the WTO has access to the single market, correct? Meaning they can export products and services based on the commitments that you find in the WTO. So that's pretty simple. Now, when you think of the single market as being part of or being a member of the single market, then that's a different thing. It's not just being able to trade or export your products to it or your services. It's actually being part of a construct which is, as in terms of level of integration, is as deep as it gets without actually having a state. So that's the difference. Now, if you want to go back to the options, some have suggested that the EEA state have almost complete access to the single market. One cannot technically say this distinction is somehow artificial. Are they a member of the single market? Possibly not, because there are certain areas that are excluded and so forth. So they're not officially member. In fact, they can't really participate in the legislative process within the EU. So I would say that even that model is not a model of membership, but is of greater access, perhaps the greatest access to the single market. So again, and perhaps I use the WTO definition of the two terms, which is sort of probably the most relevant. The free trade agreement is an agreement between at least two custom territories to eliminate tariffs to a substantial extent and other restriction to trade. We are still talking about trade restrictions. The custom union is an FTA in a free trade area with a common external tariff. That's it.
And so if there is no UK-EU trade deal in goods or services, could you explain how the EU's WTO obligations could help the UK's ability to trade with the EU?
If you haven't got the deal, as you say, you're going to trade with the EU and the rest of the world under WTO rules, MFN duties, and so on. Now, if you come to what that means in terms of obligations and rights, vis-à-vis the EU, it doesn't amount to much because it's the same. You're in WTO, you've got the same obligation and the same rights to everybody. And I said originally, the thing about WTO is that it's non-preferential. So if you say, how does that help you, I think the answer is it doesn't help you at all for your relationship with the EU. That you have to fashion through the negotiation and make the trade deal you can. If you're saying something about how does this affect your relations with third countries, then again you've got a basic framework for your relationship with all third countries.
But surely the EU can't penalise us because of their obligations under the WTO?
I don't think there's any question of penalising. I think they're simply going to apply their normal
yes.
their normal relationship with third countries.
In a sense, it's better than nothing, for sure. And there are, in the WTO, there are certain rules and principles that grant rights to WTO members, as well as obligations. So the UK will be able to rely on those rights vis-à-vis the rest of the EU. There will be areas where WTO can't help, and I mean, one could argue that in those areas the EU is free to do whatever it wants.
It's a low-level relationship, in other words, in the WTO. It's not preferential in any way.
But at least it provides a baseline and
yes.
It prevents punishment, which is the suggestion.
Yes, you can't be discriminated against.
Yeah.
Now, if you move away from this bundle of rights, which include passporting rights, and now you are back in the world of WTO, or even CETA for that matter, you go back a long way. There are certain rights under the GATS, limited to certain sectors, but they don't go as far as what the single market has achieved.
So how can you best avoid those negative impacts?
There is no...
The people have spoken.
So how can you avoid? You can't. See, there's a difference between saying 80% of our economy is based on services, which is true, but the trade relations do not reflect the same percentage.
The exports.
The export world.
Yeah.
So I think when you're looking at the export regime, the trade regime, that's what you're looking at. You could have the most liberal service industry, unregulated, efficient, and whatever you want, but if the receiving states say, no, you can't enter, there's nothing you can do. So what you need to be able to export your services is that the host state opens up to your services. At the moment, in the single market, it's not an absolute single market, but it's as good as it gets. If you step away from that, even the most advanced FTA with Korea, with Canada, they just give you a little bit more than what WTO provides. It's not massively more. It takes a lot of time because, there are it's a way to inch away those restrictions that are in place. And they have accomplished a lot. There's a discussion, a plurilateral discussion, sort of sideline of the WTO on liberalization of trading services, which includes also financial services, and so there is a push towards liberalization of trading services.
Let me put the same thing but slightly differently. What the single market is, I believe, is the ultimate of an area of free and fair competition with no real barriers. It's a competition construct. Now, if you compare that with WTO, there aren't any competition rules really in WTO at all. So if you're looking at that relationship, you've got a hell of a lot in the single market, but nothing much in WTO. And as Federico has said, you get a little bit more than WTO through a Korean or a Canadian free trade agreement, but basically you're miles away from anything that is a real free competition, free of barriers. That's the relationship.
So we move from competition to bargaining in a sense.
Yes, I mean, I think that I'm giving you it if I understand it right. This is the essential reason why the single market was created.
Thank you.
I want to talk about dispute resolution. I know it was touched upon a little bit earlier. So, with regard to the World Trade Organization, how effective is the dispute resolution mechanism? And if you could do a little compare and contrast with the ECJ, for example, as dispute resolution mechanism.
Well, if you take that comparison, the WTO isn't the same thing at all as the ECJ. The ECJ is a whole jurisdiction, and it's clear there that they make legal rulings and so on. The WTO system is it has judicial elements and it has political and practical elements. You don't have judges. You have an appellate body which has some judicial experience, and they produce rulings on interpretation of the WTO law. Now, so if you're making a comparison with the ECJ, you're really apples and oranges. You're not comparing like and like. How effective is the WTO process? I would say it's a lot more effective now than it used to be, because we tightened it up in the WTO in '95. We had a dispute settlement understanding, a new process.
I understand sort of your Brexit political mandate here, which is quite complicated, but I understand the point may be having to do with foreign judges or international tribunals telling countries what to do. I mean, in theory, there is no difference. The appellate body of the WTO may tell any of the WTO member that they cannot have a regulation that prohibits GMO products because does not comply with the SPS agreement, because the scientific evidence is not clearly there. So I think the difference with the ECJ, with the European Court, is simply because the European Union is a much deeper integration project, and it touches on many more, probably even more visible than what the WTO is. But in theory, there is no difference. All the, whether it's a panel decision or an appellate body decision or any other decision of an international tribunal, it may have the effect of telling a country that certain behavior is not complying with a specific international obligation.
That's right.
Okay, so I mean, you mentioned the point about foreign judges, and it's a bit of a motive point, and I think one of the things that we see a lot of is that people make comments about structures and institutions that have never been fully explained to British people and that kind of stuff. So there is a concern about foreign judges imposing a very different attitude of just very, very un-British decisions on the British people. But ultimately, you're suggesting there are going to be judge-like creatures.
Yes.
In the international sphere.
Yes.
Making decisions that we might not like, whatever happens.